The floating candles above the great hall flickered peacefully in the September evening, casting warm shadows across 4 long tables filled with chattering students. At the Gryffindor table, 2 identical red-headed first-years huddled together, their heads bent in whispered conspiracy. "George, are you absolutely certain about the wand movement?" Fred Weasley muttered, glancing nervously at the high table, where Professor McGonagall was engaged in conversation with Professor Flitwick. "Course I am," George replied with more confidence than he felt. "Charlie showed me over summer. Sort of. Well, I watched through the keyhole while he was practicing." Fred grinned at his twin. "Brilliant. And you're sure it was for colourful sparks?" "Definitely sparks. Probably colourful." George pulled his wand from his robes, the Hollywood still unfamiliar in his grip after only 2 weeks at Hogwarts. "On 3? The twins raised their wands toward the enchanted ceiling, aiming at the cluster of candles floating directly above the Slytherin table. In their 11-year-old minds, the plan was simple. Make the candles shower harmless, colourful sparks over their rival house during pudding. A bit of harmless fun to establish their reputation. "1, Fred whispered. 2, George continued. 3. They spoke in unison, waving their wands in what they believed was the correct pattern. The effect was instantaneous, and nothing like what they'd intended. Instead of gentle, colourful sparks, the targeted candles exploded into massive fountains of multicoloured fire. Torrents of purple, green, and gold flames cascaded down like magical waterfalls. The Slytherin table erupted in screams as students dove for cover, though the flames seemed more shocking than harmful. But the spell didn't stop there. Like a magical infection, it spread from candle to candle across the ceiling. Within seconds, the entire Great Hall was illuminated by a pyrotechnic display that would have impressed even the most experienced wizard. Flames of every colour imaginable rained down while the candles spun wildly, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope effect. "What have you done?" Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Her pointed hat had been singed by a particularly enthusiastic burst of orange flame. The twins exchanged a look of mingled horror and delight. This was far beyond anything they'd imagined, and while part of them knew they were in tremendous trouble, another part couldn't help but admire the spectacular nature of their failure. "Finite incantatem," Professor Dumbledore's calm voice rang out, and with a wave of his wand, the magical fire show ceased. The candles returned to their normal, peaceful state, though several were now sporting jaunty angles, and what appeared to be permanent colour tints. In the sudden silence, every eye in the Great Hall turned to the Gryffindor table, where Fred and George Weasley sat, with their wands still raised, and identical expressions of attempted innocence plastered across their freckled faces. "Weasley and Weasley?" Professor McGonagall approached them with the slow, deliberate pace of a cat stalking mice. "Would you care to explain why you felt the need to transform dinner into a pyrotechnic exhibition?" "We were just," Fred began. "Trying to add some colour," George continued, "to what we felt was a rather dull Tuesday evening," Fred finished. Professor McGonagall's lips thinned to the point of invisibility. "Detention, both of you, for the next week. You'll be assisting Mr. Filch with his duties, without magic." The twins' faces fell in perfect synchronization. Detention with Filch was legendary among Hogwarts students for being particularly unpleasant. The caretaker's hatred of magic and students in equal measure made him a formidable detention overseer. And 20 points from Gryffindor, McGonagall added, causing groans from their housemates. Each. As she swept back to the high table, Fred noticed something odd. Was that the tiniest upturn at the corner of her mouth? No, surely not. Professor McGonagall never smiled at pranks. "Wicked," a voice said from across the table. The twins looked up to see a dark-skinned boy with neat dreadlocks grinning at them. "Lee Jordan," he introduced himself. "That was the most brilliant disaster I've ever seen." "Disaster?" George asked, mock offended. "That was exactly what we intended." "Really?" Lee's eyes widened. "No," Fred admitted with a rueful grin. "It was supposed to be just small sparks over the Slytherins." Lee laughed. "Even better. Accidental chaos is the best kind. My dad always says the greatest inventions come from magnificent failures." The twins perked up at this. Here was someone who understood. "You'll want to be careful with Filch, though," Lee continued, lowering his voice. "He's been in a right foul mood since someone charmed all his cleaning supplies to run away from him. It took him 3 days to catch the last mop." "Who did that?" George asked admiringly. Lee's grin widened. "No idea. But whoever it was must be a genius." The modest way he examined his fingernails told the twins everything they needed to know. The next evening found Fred and George trudging through the dungeons toward Filch's office, their spirits considerably dampened by the prospect of a week's worth of manual labor. "Remind me again why we thought annoying the Slytherins was worth this," George muttered as they passed a particularly slimy stretch of wall. "Because," Fred replied with diminished enthusiasm, "we're going to be Hogwarts legends." "Hogwarts legends who scrub floors without magic," George countered. They knocked on Filch's door and were greeted by a raspy "Enter" from within. The office was exactly as grim as they'd imagined. Chains and manacles hung from the walls, purely decorative these days, they hoped, and filing cabinets labelled with various infractions lined every wall. Mrs. Norris, Filch's skeletal cat, watched them from atop a cabinet with lamp-like yellow eyes. "The Weasley twins," Filch said with obvious relish, "the boys who nearly burned down the Great Hall." "That's a bit dramatic," Fred protested. "It was just a colourful fire." "Magical fire," George added helpfully. "Very different from regular burning." Filch's face purpled. "You dunderheads could have hurt someone. In my day, you'd have been hung by your thumbs in the dungeons." The twins exchanged glances. They'd heard rumours about Filch's bitterness regarding his lack of magical ability, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. "Right then," Filch continued, seeming to compose himself. "You'll be cleaning the trophy room tonight. Every trophy, every plaque, every bit of silver until it shines. And no magic." He held out a grimy bucket filled with rags and foul-smelling polish. The trophy room was vast, filled with centuries' worth of Hogwarts achievements. Quidditch cups, house championships, awards for special services to the school, all covered in a layer of dust that suggested Filch's cleaning standards were somewhat selective. "This is going to take forever," George groaned, examining a particularly tarnished Quidditch trophy from 1743. "Maybe not," Fred said slowly, studying the room's layout. "If we split up and work systematically." "No talking," Filch barked from the doorway where he'd stationed himself in a rickety chair. "Just work." They worked in silence for perhaps 20 minutes before Fred noticed something odd about one of the trophy cases. Behind an award for excellence in experimental charms, 1962. The wood panelling seemed slightly different from the surrounding wall. He nudged George and nodded toward it. George, understanding immediately, began polishing that case with exaggerated thoroughness, while Fred investigated. "What are you doing?" Filch demanded, starting to rise from his chair. "Just being thorough, Mr. Filch," George said innocently. "This case is particularly dirty, probably needs extra attention." As Filch settled back suspiciously, Fred pressed against the odd panel. To his amazement, it gave way slightly. A hidden catch. He pressed harder and felt something click. The panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The twins' eyes met in perfect understanding. This was it. Their first real Hogwarts secret. But how to explore it, with Filch watching? As if in answer to their silent prayer, a tremendous crash echoed from somewhere above them. Filch leapt to his feet, his face purple with rage. "Peeves," he snarled. "If that poltergeist is throwing suits of armor again." He pointed a gnarled finger at the twins. "You two stay here and keep working. If you move 1 inch, I'll know." The moment he stormed out, Fred and George were at the hidden passage. "We can't," George said, though his eyes gleamed with curiosity. "If he comes back and we're gone—" "Quick look," Fred insisted, "just to see where it goes." They squeezed through the opening, finding themselves in a narrow stone corridor, thick with dust and cobwebs. Their footsteps echoed softly as they crept forward, wands lit despite Filch's ban on magic. The passage wound upward, clearly built between walls, occasionally offering grimy windows into other rooms. They glimpsed the library, a classroom they didn't recognize, and what appeared to be a storage room full of broken furniture. "Fred," George whispered urgently, "we need to get back." But Fred had stopped at another window, this one looking into what seemed to be an unused classroom. Desks were stacked against one wall, and thick dust covered everything. But what caught his attention was a large bookshelf that had been pulled away from the wall, revealing another passage entrance. "Look at this place," he breathed. "It's perfect." "Perfect for what?" George asked, though he was already thinking the same thing. "Our laboratory," Fred grinned. "Think about it. Hidden, abandoned, with secret passages for quick escapes." The sound of Filch's returning footsteps, accompanied by his mutual cursing of Peeves and all students in general, sent them racing back through the passage. They tumbled out into the trophy room just as the door opened. "Still working, I see," Filch said suspiciously, noting their flushed faces and heavy breathing. "Oh yes," George said, holding up a polishing rag. "Very hard work cleaning." "Makes you breathe heavy," Fred added. "All that rubbing." Filch's eyes narrowed, but he couldn't prove anything. He resumed his position in the chair, and the twins returned to their task with renewed energy. They had a secret now, a real Hogwarts secret, and the possibilities were endless. The rest of the week's detentions passed in a blur of mopping, scrubbing, and polishing, but the twins barely noticed. Their minds were full of plans for their secret classroom. They'd need supplies, of course, and books on magical theory, and ingredients for experiments. "Where are we going to get money for all this?" George asked on their final night of detention, as they cleaned the ancient suits of armor in the corridor outside the Great Hall. Fred paused in his polishing of a particularly rusty helmet. "We could ask Mum and Dad." "For money to buy joke supplies?" George interrupted. "After we've just lost Gryffindor 40 points and earned a week of detention." "Good point." Fred resumed his polishing thoughtfully. Then he brightened. What if we didn't buy them? What if we made things to sell? George considered this. Sell to who? Other students? Think about it. Everyone loves a good prank, but not everyone knows how to make them. We could be suppliers. Entrepreneurs, George said, testing the word out. Businessmen, Fred agreed. The Weasley brothers, purveyors of magical mischief, George grinned. They were so caught up in their planning that they didn't notice Filch approaching until his shadow fell over them. Time's up, he said, sounding almost disappointed. Your detention's over. The twins jumped to their feet, eager to escape. But mark my words, Filch continued, his pale eyes glittering malevolently. I'll be watching you two. One more toe out of line, and it's straight back here, and next time I'll have you cleaning the bedpans in the hospital wing. We'll be perfect angels, Mr. Filch, Fred promised. Absolute saints, George agreed. As they walked back to Gryffindor Tower, Lee Jordan fell into step beside them. Survived Filch, then? He asked cheerfully. Heard he had you polishing everything in sight. It wasn't all bad, Fred said with a mysterious smile. We made some interesting discoveries, George added. Lee's eyes sharpened with interest. Oh, really? Do tell. The twins exchanged looks. Could they trust him? Lee had proven himself a kindred spirit, and they'd need help with their plans. Can you keep a secret? Fred asked. Better than anyone, Lee promised solemnly. George glanced around to ensure they were alone in the corridor. We found a secret passage and an abandoned classroom. Perfect for projects. Lee's face split into a delighted grin. Wicked. What kind of projects? The kind that might earn us both detention and gold, Fred said. The kind that'll make us legends, George added. Or get us expelled, Lee pointed out, though he was still grinning. Well, Fred said philosophically, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. Or in our case, George continued, you can't revolutionize magical pranking without risking a few explosions. Count me in, Lee said immediately. When do we start? As they reached the portrait of the fat lady, Fred felt a surge of excitement. This was it, the beginning of something brilliant. They had a secret base, a business partner, and heads full of ideas. Password? The fat lady asked primly. Fortuna Major, George replied, and the portrait swung open. As they climbed through the portrait hole into the warm common room, Fred caught sight of their brother Percy, bent over his textbooks in a corner. Perfect badge already gleaming on his chest, despite being only a third year. We should probably keep this from Percy, he murmured to George. Keep what from Percy? A voice asked behind them. They turned to find Charlie, their second eldest brother, looking at them with amused suspicion. As a sixth-year and Quidditch captain, Charlie commanded considerable respect, even from the twins. Nothing, they said in unison, which of course made them look incredibly guilty. Charlie's eyes narrowed, but his smile was fond. Whatever you're planning, just try not to get expelled in your first year, all right? Mum would have kittens. Would we ever do anything to upset our dear mother? Fred asked innocently. Yes, Charlie said flatly. Constantly. Just remember, I can't cover for you if you do something truly stupid. Define truly stupid, George said. Anything that makes McGonagall's hair turn white or causes Dumbledore to stop twinkling, Charlie replied. Those are the danger signs. As he walked away to join his friends, the twins and Lee huddled by the fire. So, Lee said quietly, when do we check out this secret room? Tomorrow, Fred decided. After classes. We'll need to map out the passages properly, make sure we know all the entrances and exits. And then? George prompted, though he already knew the answer. Then, Fred grinned, the firelight dancing in his eyes. We started creating chaos, professionally. George raised an imaginary glass, to the beginning of a beautiful partnership. To detention well served, Lee added. To the prank that started it all, Fred finished. As they sat by the dying fire, planning their empire of mischief, none of them could have imagined how far their dreams would take them. They couldn't see the joke shop that would one day light up Diagon Alley, or the products that would aid a resistance movement, or the legacy that would outlive them all. All they knew was that they had each other, a secret room, and the absolute certainty that they were destined to leave their mark on Hogwarts. And somewhere high above in his circular office, Albus Dumbledore sat reading reports of the evening's detentions. When he came to Filch's grudging note that the Weasley twins had served their punishment without major incident, his eyes twinkled behind his half-moon spectacles. No major incidents that you noticed, Argus, he murmured to himself, stroking his phoenix forks. I have a feeling those two will bear watching. Great things come from such magnificent disasters. Forks trilled softly in agreement, and Dumbledore returned to his papers, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Hogwarts had seen many troublemakers in its 1,000-year history, but something told him the Weasley twins would be remembered long after they'd left these halls. He was, as usual, entirely correct. Spring had arrived at Hogwarts with a vengeance, bringing torrential rains that turned the grounds into a muddy swamp and kept most students indoors. For Fred and George Weasley, however, the weather was perfect. Fewer people wandering the corridors meant less chance of discovery as they made their way to their secret laboratory. Did you get the salamander scales? George whispered, as they slipped behind the fourth-floor mirror, their arms full of borrowed supplies. Nicked them from Snape's stores yesterday during potions, Fred confirmed, patting his bulging pocket. He was too busy terrorizing the Hufflepuffs to notice. They navigated the narrow passage with practiced ease, having spent months mapping every twist and turn. The abandoned classroom had been transformed over the winter into what they grandly called Weasley's Experimental Workshop. Old cauldrons salvaged from the dungeons bubbled with various concoctions, sheets of parchment covered in scrawled formulae papered the walls, and boxes of ingredients were stacked haphazardly on every surface. Lee Jordan was already there, stirring a vivid purple mixture that occasionally sparked gold. About time, he said without looking up. This batch of hiccuping humbugs is almost ready. Brilliant, George said, dumping his armload of supplies onto a cleared desk. How long did the last test subject hiccup for? 4 hours, Lee replied proudly, though Marcus Flint wasn't exactly a willing volunteer, more of an accidental sampling when we dropped one in his pumpkin juice. Fred laughed, remembering the Slytherin chaser's increasingly desperate attempts to stop his volcanic hiccups during Quidditch practice. Worth losing those house points, that was. Speaking of which, George said, pulling out their business ledger, a worn notebook they'd started keeping to track their experiments, expenses, and occasional profits. We're running low on funds again. The Canary Cream experiments ate through most of our Christmas money. Those were expensive failures, Fred admitted, glancing at the cage in the corner where they'd kept their test subjects. The cage was empty now, its former occupants having eventually transformed back from various exotic birds into very annoyed mice. "We're close, though," Lee insisted. "The last batch only turned me into a flamingo for 20 minutes instead of 2 hours." "And you stayed pink for 3 days after," George reminded him. "Details?" Lee waved dismissively. "The point is, we're making progress." Fred had wandered over to their main workstation, where their latest project, Giggling Gum, was reaching its final stage. The pale yellow substance looked innocent enough, but their previous attempts had resulted in uncontrollable laughter that lasted for hours, and, in one memorable case, caused a test subject, Lee again, to laugh so hard he couldn't breathe properly. "Right," Fred said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's add the salamander scales and see if that stabilizes the reaction time." George consulted their notes. Theory says it should limit the effect to 30 minutes max. Theory also said our color-changing ink would only affect parchment, Lee pointed out. "Remember what happened there?" The twins winced in unison. That particular disaster was still visible in certain corridors where the ink had seeped into the stone itself, creating rainbow patterns that pulsed and shifted with the castle's moods. "That was a learning experience," Fred said diplomatically. "An expensive learning experience," George added, checking the ledger again. "Filch made us buy the cleaning supplies to try and remove it. I still haven't managed it completely." They worked in concentrated silence for a while, carefully measuring and adding ingredients. The giggling gum began to emit small puffs of sparkly smoke that smelled like strawberries and made them feel lightheaded with suppressed mirth. "I think it's working," Lee said, fighting back a giggle. "Quick, bubblehead charms," George ordered, "before we all end up laughing ourselves sick." They cast the charms just in time. Even through the magical barrier, they could feel the effects trying to take hold. The gum was now a cheerful pink color and seemed to be humming quietly to itself. "Right," Fred said, his voice slightly muffled by the charm. "Who's testing it?" The 3 boys looked at each other. After the canary cream incidents, they'd instituted a rotation system for testing, but nobody could remember whose turn it was. "Rock, parchment wand?" Lee suggested. Before they could begin, a tremendous bang shook the entire room. One of their experimental cauldrons had exploded, sending a geyser of color-changing ink shooting toward the ceiling. But this wasn't ordinary ink. It was their latest attempt at permanent prank ink, designed to write embarrassing messages that only appeared hours after application. "Containment charms!" George yelled, but it was too late. The ink splattered across the ceiling and began seeping through the stones. Within seconds, they heard shrieks from the classroom above. "Oh no," Fred groaned. "That's Professor Vector's arithmancy classroom." "We need to get out," Lee said urgently. "If they trace it back here—" But George was already moving, shoving their most incriminating experiments into a hidden compartment they discovered behind a loose stone. "Emergency evacuation protocol," he barked. "Fred, grab the ledger and the money box. Lee, those bottles of viable products." They worked with the efficiency of those who'd practiced this scenario, though they'd hoped never to use it. Within minutes, they'd cleared the most important items and were racing through the secret passage. They emerged from behind the mirror just as Professor McGonagall came striding down the corridor, her tartan robes billowing. Students were pouring out of classrooms, pointing at the ceiling where words were beginning to appear in shimmering, color-changing script. "Professor Vector secretly loves divination." "Weasley! Weasley!" McGonagall's voice could have shattered glass. The twins froze, trying to look innocent despite their flushed faces and the telltale smell of strawberries clinging to their robes. "Yes, Professor," they said in perfect unison. "Don't you?" "Yes, Professor me," she snapped. "I suppose you two know nothing about the magical ink currently defacing my ceiling?" "Magical ink?" Fred asked, eyes wide with feigned surprise. "Defacing the ceiling," George added, looking up as if noticing for the first time. "Oh my, that's terrible." "Who would do such a thing?" Lee chimed in, earning himself a sharp look from McGonagall. "Mr. Jordan, I don't recall asking for your input," she said coldly. "As for you two," she paused, sniffing the air suspiciously. "Why do you smell like strawberries?" "New soap," George said quickly. "From home," Fred added. "Mum's really into fruit scents lately," George elaborated unnecessarily. McGonagall's nostrils flared. Just then, Professor Vector emerged from her classroom, her usually perfectly coiffed hair now sporting patches of violently orange and purple streaks where the ink had dripped. "Minerva," she said with deadly calm, "I believe some of your Gryffindors have been experimenting with magical substances again." "Indeed," McGonagall replied, her Scottish accent thickening with displeasure. "Mr. Weasley, and Mr. Jordan, you will accompany me to my office. Now." As they trudged after her, Fred noticed more messages appearing on the ceiling. "The Bloody Baron writes poetry. Mrs. Norris is secretly a highly trained ministry spy. Dumbledore's middle name is actually Brian, not Wulfric." Despite their impending doom, George had to bite his lip to keep from laughing. They'd programmed the ink with random, embarrassing secrets as a test run. The fact that it was working perfectly was both gratifying and terrifying. McGonagall's office was exactly as stern as its occupant, sparse, organized, and decorated with moving photographs of past Gryffindor Quidditch teams. She sat behind her desk and fixed them with a stare that could have frozen fire. "Explain," she commanded. The three boys exchanged glances, silently debating how much to reveal. "It was an accident," Fred began. "We were practicing color change charms for our charms essay," George continued. "And something went wrong with the wand movement," Lee finished. "I see," McGonagall said dryly. "And this accidental charm just happened to create ink that writes embarrassing messages about staff members?" "Remarkable coincidence, that," Fred said weakly. "Quite magical, really," George added. "The wonders of accidental magic," Lee concluded. McGonagall's eye twitched. "Do you three think I was born yesterday? I've been teaching at this school since before your parents were students. I know the difference between accidental magic and deliberate experimentation." She leaned forward, her expression shifting slightly. "What concerns me, boys, is not that you're experimenting. Curious minds often do. What concerns me is the lack of safety precautions and the potential for serious harm." "But Professor," George protested, "we're always careful." "Careful?" McGonagall interrupted. "Mr. Weasley, in the past 6 months alone, you've flooded 3 corridors, set fire to a suit of armor, turned 24 mice into exotic birds, and now you've potentially permanently altered the molecular structure of the castle's ceiling stones. Does that sound careful to you?" Put like that, Fred had to admit it didn't. "Furthermore," she continued, "you've been using abandoned classrooms without permission, stealing ingredients from the potion stores, and conducting experiments without proper supervision. Do you have any idea how dangerous unsupervised magical experimentation can be? We're trying to create joke products, Lee said quietly. Not dark magic. McGonagall's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Jordan, the line between a harmless joke and harmful magic can be thinner than you realize. What if your giggling gum? Yes, I know about that too. Caused someone to suffocate from laughter? What if your color-changing ink had been acidic? The boys shifted uncomfortably. They hadn't really considered those possibilities. However, McGonagall continued, surprising them, I must admit that your creations show a remarkable understanding of magical theory for first years. The spellwork required to make ink that delays its message appearance is NEUT level transfiguration. Fred and George perked up at what sounded almost like praise. Which is why, McGonagall said, instead of expulsion, which Professor Vector is currently advocating, I'm going to propose an alternative punishment. Alternative? George asked hopefully. You will serve detention every Saturday for the remainder of the term, McGonagall stated, but not with Mr. Filch. You'll be with Professor Flitwick and myself, learning proper experimental protocols and safety procedures. The twins blinked in surprise. This was unexpected. You clearly have talent, McGonagall continued. Misdirected, perhaps, but talent nonetheless. If you're going to insist on creating these products, you'll do so safely and with supervision. You mean, Fred started. Can we keep inventing? George finished. Under strict supervision and within clearly defined parameters, McGonagall said firmly. Any unsanctioned experiments will result in immediate expulsion. Is that understood? Yes, Professor, all three boys exclaimed. Good. You'll also pay for the ceiling repairs from any profits you make from your ventures, and 50 points from Gryffindor for today's incident. Their faces fell at the house points loss, but it was better than expulsion. One more thing, McGonagall added, as they stood to leave. Your brother Charlie mentioned you'd been asking him about advanced spell work. In the future, perhaps consider asking a professor instead of spying through keyholes. Fred's ears turned red. So Charlie had known all along. As they left McGonagall's office, they found Charlie himself waiting in the corridor, arms crossed, but with an amused expression. Supervised experimentation, eh? He said. Could be worse. Could be expelled. Did you tell her? George asked accusingly. Tell her what? Charlie replied innocently. That my little brothers are budding magical inventors who nearly blew up a secret laboratory. I wouldn't dream of it. You knew about the lab? Fred squeaked. Fred, George, Charlie said patiently. I'm a prefect. It's my job to know what's happening in Gryffindor. But I figured as long as you weren't getting hurt or hurting others, a bit of experimentation wasn't the worst thing. He ruffled their hair affectionately. Though, maybe next time, test your product somewhere that won't rain magical ink on Professor Vector's head. She's still upset about the time someone charmed all her equations to solve themselves incorrectly. That wasn't us, the twins protested. That was before we even started at Hogwarts, Lee added. Charlie grinned. I know. That was me. Where do you think you get it from? As he walked away, whistling cheerfully, the twins stared after him in shock. Our brother? Fred said slowly. The prefect, George continued. The responsible one, Lee added, was a prankster. They finished together. This revelation kept them occupied as they made their way to the Great Hall for dinner. The ceiling had been restored to its normal enchanted sky, though a few faint outlines of words could still be seen if you knew where to look. So, Lee said as they sat down. Supervised experimentation. That's actually not, bad. Better than not bad, George said thoughtfully. If McGonagall and Flitwick are teaching us proper techniques, we'll be able to create even better products, Fred finished, grinning. They pulled out their ledger, which had survived the evacuation, and began planning. With proper supervision, they could learn advanced magical theory years before their classmates. Their products would be safer, more effective, and more profitable. We should write to Mum, George said suddenly. Tell her we're getting extra tutoring from professors. She'll be thrilled, Fred agreed. Her troublemaker sons finally taking education seriously. We are taking it seriously, Lee pointed out. Just not the way she expects. As dinner appeared on the golden plates, Percy strode over, his prefect badge gleaming and his expression disapproving. I heard about your latest disaster, he said stiffly. Honestly, you two are an embarrassment to the family name. Or Perce, Fred said cheerfully. We're hurt, truly wounded. Devastated even, George added. We're getting extra lessons from McGonagall herself, Lee informed him. That's quite an honour for first years. Percy's expression soured further. Even he hadn't managed individual instruction from professors yet. Yes, well, see that you don't waste the opportunity with more foolishness. As he stalked away, the twins high-fived under the table. This is it, Fred said quietly. The real beginning. No more amateur hour. Professional pranksters in training, George agreed. With professor supervision, Lee added with a grin. That night, as they lay in their dormitory beds, the twins whispered across the darkness. George. Yeah, Fred. We're going to be brilliant, aren't we? The most brilliant wizards Hogwarts has ever seen. Modest, too. Naturally. They fell asleep, dreaming of joke shops and successful products, of a business empire built on laughter and chaos. Neither of them could have known that their supervised sessions with McGonagall and Flitwick would provide the foundation for every product they'd eventually create, or that the professor who'd caught them would one day be one of their proudest supporters. But for now, they were just two 11-year-old boys with big dreams, bigger imaginations, and the absolute certainty that they were destined to leave their mark on the wizarding world. One explosion at a time. Snow fell thick and silent over Hogwarts Castle, blanketing the grounds in pristine white that muffled all sound except the occasional crack of ice from the Black Lake. Inside, however, the corridors buzzed with pre-Christmas excitement as students prepared for the holidays. For Fred and George Weasley, now in their third year, the seasonal chaos provided perfect cover for their latest mission. Filch is definitely hiding something, Fred muttered, as they huddled in an alcove near the caretaker's office, watching him limp past with a mysterious bundle clutched protectively to his chest. That's the third time this week he's gone to his office with packages, George observed. And did you see how he practically hexed that first year who got too close yesterday? Lee Jordan, their constant accomplice, shifted restlessly beside them. Maybe it's just Christmas presents. Even Filch might have friends. Somewhere. Possibly. The twins gave him identical looks of skepticism. All right, probably not, Lee conceded. But breaking into his office, that's a new level of rule-breaking, even for us. We're not breaking in, Fred said with dignity. We're conducting reconnaissance. For educational purposes, George added piously. To better understand the castle's administrative procedures, Fred continued. By nicking whatever Filch is hoarding, Lee finished dryly. Exactly, the twins said in unison. They'd been planning this for weeks, ever since their supervised experimentation sessions with McGonagall and Flitwick had introduced them to more advanced magical concepts. Their products were improving dramatically. The canary creams now worked perfectly, transforming the eater into a large canary for exactly 10 minutes before molting their feathers in a spectacular fashion. The giggling gum had been refined to produce pleasant laughter for precisely 30 minutes. They'd even developed a line of skiving snack boxes that could simulate various minor illnesses to get students out of classes. But they needed more. More secret passages to avoid professors when testing products. More hiding places for their inventory. More ways to stay ahead of Filch's increasingly paranoid attempts to catch them red-handed. "He's gone," George whispered as Filch disappeared around a corner. "Now's our chance." They approached the office door cautiously. Fred pulled out his wand and whispered, "Alohomora." Nothing happened. "Of course not," Lee said. "Filch may be a squib, but he's not stupid. He'll have asked a professor to put proper locking charms on it." George was already examining the door more carefully. "Look here," he said, pointing to a series of small scratches near the keyhole. "These aren't random. They're runes." Fred squinted at them. Thanks to their Ancient Runes elective, he could just make out their meaning. "It's a password lock. We need to speak the right phrase." "Brilliant," Lee said sarcastically. "I'm sure Filch chose something obvious like 'I hate children' or 'detention for everyone.'" But George was thinking, what does Filch love more than anything? "Making students miserable," Fred suggested. "Mrs. Norris," George said firmly, "try her name." Fred cleared his throat. "Mrs. Norris." The door remained firmly locked. "My sweet Mrs. Norris." Lee tried. Nothing. They spent several minutes trying various combinations involving the scraggly cat's name before George had another idea. What if it's not English? McGonagall mentioned that Filch has been at Hogwarts for decades. He might have picked up some magical languages. Fred closed his eyes, thinking back to their charms lessons. "Felix Felicis," he tried, mangling the pronunciation terribly. Still nothing. "Mrs. Norris est Optima," George attempted, combining the cat's name with basic Latin. There was a soft click, and the door swung open. "Merlin's beard," Lee breathed. It actually worked. They slipped inside quickly, closing the door behind them. Filch's office was exactly as grim as they remembered from their first-year detentions, but now they noticed details they'd missed before. Filing cabinets lined every wall, labeled with things like confiscated items, dangerous, detention records, 1970s, and most intriguingly, confiscated items, highly dangerous, do not touch. "Start with that one," Fred said immediately, pointing to the last cabinet. But George had noticed something else. On Filch's desk, partially hidden under a stack of detention forms, was what looked like a piece of old parchment. "Fred, look at this," he called softly. They gathered around the desk. The parchment appeared blank at first, but there was something about it that seemed aware, as if it was watching them. "It's magical," Lee said unnecessarily. "But what does it do?" Fred picked it up carefully, his wand ready in case it was cursed. The moment his fingers touched the parchment, words began to appear. Mr. Mooney presents his compliments to Mr. Filch and begs him to keep his abnormally large nose out of other people's business. The twins gasped in delight. The parchment was insulting Filch, or rather, it thought Fred was Filch. More writing appeared. Mr. Prongs agrees with Mr. Mooney and would like to add that Mr. Filch is an ugly git. Mr. Padfoot would like to register his astonishment that an idiot like that ever became caretaker of Hogwarts. Mr. Wormtail bids Mr. Filch good day and advises him to wash his hair, the slime ball. "This is brilliant," George exclaimed. "It's charmed to insult whoever tries to read it." But Fred was thinking, "No, wait. Look at those names. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs. Those aren't insults, they're signatures. This was made by students." "Students with a serious grudge against Filch," Lee added appreciatively. George had pulled out his wand. "Let me try something." He tapped the parchment and said clearly, "We solemnly swear we are up to no good." Nothing happened. "Why did you say that?" Fred asked. "Don't know," George admitted. "It just felt right, like the parchment was suggesting it." Fred took the parchment back and tapped it with his own wand. "I solemnly swear I am up to no good." The effect was immediate and incredible. The insults vanished, replaced by an elegant script that proclaimed, "Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs Purveyors, of aids to magical mischief makers, are proud to present the Marauder's map." But that was only the beginning. Ink spread from the center of the parchment like spilled water, racing across the page in thin lines that formed corridors, rooms, and staircases. Within seconds, they were looking at a complete map of Hogwarts Castle, more detailed than anything they'd ever seen. "Bloody hell," Lee whispered. But the true magic became apparent when tiny labeled dots began moving across the map. Each dot bore a name, and they were moving through the corridors in real time. "That's Dumbledore," George said, pointing to a dot pacing in what must be his office. "And there's McGonagall in the Transfiguration classroom." "There's us," Fred exclaimed, finding 3 dots labelled Fred Weasley, George Weasley, and Lee Jordan, clustered in Filch's office. "And there's—" Lee's voice turned urgent. "There's Filch. He's coming back." Sure enough, a dot labelled Argus Filch was moving rapidly toward his office, accompanied by the ever-present Mrs. Norris. "Quick," George hissed. "Put everything back." Fred hastily tapped the map with his wand. "Mischief managed." The map went blank immediately, as if it understood the urgency. He shoved it inside his robes, while George and Lee frantically straightened the desk. They burst out of the office, just as Filch rounded the corner, pulling the door shut behind them. "What are you doing here?" Filch snarled, his pale eyes bulging with suspicion. "Looking for you, actually," Fred said, thinking quickly. "We found a dung bomb in the 3rd-floor corridor. Thought you should know." Filch's expression went from suspicious to murderous. "Dung bombs? Where?" "Near the statue of Boris the Bewildered," George supplied helpfully. As Filch limped off, muttering dire threats about dung bomb-dropping delinquents, the 3 boys exchanged triumphant grins. "That was too close," Lee said once Filch was out of earshot. "But worth it," Fred said, patting his robes where the map was hidden. "Do you realize what this means?" "We'll never get caught again," George breathed. "We can see everyone, everywhere, all the time." They retreated to an empty classroom to examine their prize properly. The map revealed secrets they'd never imagined, passages they'd never found, rooms they'd never known existed, and most importantly, the exact location of every person in the castle. "Look at all these passages," George marveled. "There's one right behind that mirror on the 4th floor. We were so close to finding it ourselves." "And this one leads right to Hogsmeade," Fred noted excitedly. We could sneak out whenever we want. Sell our products to a wider market, Lee added, his business mind already working. They spent the next hour exploring the map's features, discovering that it updated in real time and even showed when secret passages were in use. It was, without question, the most incredible magical artifact they'd ever encountered. Those marauders, George said admiringly, they must have been legends. We should find out who they were, Fred suggested. Maybe they left other stuff behind. First things first, Lee said practically. How are we going to use this to expand our business? The twins looked at each other, minds racing with possibilities. Testing products will be child's play now, Fred said. We can avoid professors completely. Set up multiple storage locations, George added. Always stay one step ahead of Filch. Map out the perfect distribution routes, Lee contributed. Hit every common room without being seen. Over the next few weeks, the Marauders' map revolutionized their operations. They discovered a network of passages that allowed them to move products throughout the castle undetected. Their skiving snack boxes became so popular that they had to limit sales to prevent mass-class walkouts. The canary creams were a hit at the Christmas feast, with dozens of students briefly transforming into giant canaries before molting spectacularly. But their success didn't go unnoticed. Someone selling unauthorized magical items, Percy announced at the Gryffindor table one morning. As a prefect, it's my duty to investigate and put a stop to it. Fred and George exchanged innocent looks over their porridge. Unauthorized magical items? George asked. How terrible. What kind of person would do such a thing? Fred added. Percy's eyes narrowed. Don't think I don't suspect you two. You've been far too quiet lately. We've been studying, George said virtuously. Professor McGonagall says our transfiguration work is improving remarkably. This was actually true. Their supervised sessions had taught them advanced techniques that they immediately applied to product development. McGonagall seemed pleased with their progress, though occasionally she'd give them knowing looks when students arrived at her class with mysterious maladies that cleared up exactly 45 minutes later. Speaking of studying, Lee interrupted, checking his watch. We should get to charms. Flitwick's teaching Protean charms today. As they left Percy glowering at his eggs, Fred pulled out the map for a quick check. The coast was clear to their latest storage room, where they needed to collect inventory for the day's orders. Hang on, George said, looking over his shoulder. Who's that? There was a dot in their storage room, but the label was strange. Instead of a name, it simply read, Peter Pettigrew. Never heard of him? Lee said. Must be a ghost we haven't met. But Fred was frowning. The map shows ghosts differently. They're silver dots, not black. This Peter Pettigrew is shown as alive. Probably an error, George decided. The map's old, could be malfunctioning. They checked the room carefully when they arrived, but found no one. Their inventory was untouched, all products accounted for. Definitely a malfunction, Lee concluded. Still, the map's too useful to worry about one glitchy dot. They loaded their bags with the day's orders. Nosebleed nougats for a group of fifth years facing a particularly brutal history of magic test. Fainting fancies for third years wanting out of potions, and a special request for canary creams from some Ravenclaws planning a birthday surprise. Business was booming. Their ledger showed profits that would have made their mother faint and their father beam with pride. They were even considering legitimate advertising, though George insisted they maintain some level of secrecy to preserve the underground appeal. "We should develop new products," Fred said during a strategy session in their dormitory. "Diversify our range." "Portable swamps," George suggested immediately. "Imagine being able to flood any corridor instantly." "Decoy detonators," Lee added. "Create a distraction anywhere in the castle." "Extendable ears," Fred said thoughtfully, "for eavesdropping on important conversations." They were so engrossed in planning that they almost missed the dot on the map labelled Severus Snape, heading directly for Gryffindor Tower. "Snape's coming," Lee yelped. "Why's Snape coming to Gryffindor Tower?" They scrambled to hide their evidence, maps, ledgers, and product samples vanishing into various concealed spots they'd created over the years. By the time Snape swept into their dormitory, they were sitting innocently on their beds, textbooks open. "Weasley, Weasley, Jordan." Snape's voice was silk over poison. "I've received reports of students falling mysteriously ill after consuming sweets of unknown origin." "How terrible," Fred said with wide eyes. "Quite shocking," George agreed. "Who would poison innocent students?" Lee asked, managing to sound genuinely appalled. Snape's black eyes glittered dangerously. "Indeed, who would? Perhaps someone with access to potions' ingredients and the knowledge to use them?" "You think we're poisoning people?" George asked indignantly. "Professor, we're hurt by the accusation." "Deeply wounded," Fred confirmed. "I think," Snape said slowly, "that you're selling products that simulate illness to help students skip classes, which, while not technically poisoning, is certainly against school rules." The twins maintained their innocent expressions, but internally they were impressed. Snape had figured out their scheme remarkably quickly. "If you have evidence, Professor," Fred said carefully, "we'd be happy to address your concerns." "But baseless accusations," George added, "seem rather unfair." Snape's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Oh, I'll find evidence. And when I do, it won't be detention you're facing. It will be an expulsion." He swept out as dramatically as he'd entered, leaving the three boys in tense silence. "He's on to us," Lee said unnecessarily. "We need to be more careful," George agreed, pulling out the map to track Snape's movement. "Maybe lay low for a while." But Fred was grinning. "Are you kidding? This is exactly what we needed. A proper adversary, someone to test our skills against." "Fred," George said slowly, a matching grin spreading across his face, "are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "The ultimate prank war," Fred confirmed. "Us versus Snape. The winner takes all." "You're both mental," Lee said, but he was grinning too. "Absolutely barking mad. When do we start?" They spent the rest of the evening planning, the Marauders' map spread between them as they plotted routes and contingencies. They'd need to be cleverer than ever, more careful with their products, more creative with their pranks. "We should study the Marauders," George suggested. "Learn from the masters. They must have dealt with suspicious professors too." "And we should improve our products," Fred added. "Make them undetectable by standard revealing charms." "Snape won't know what hit him," Lee said confidently. As midnight approached and they finally headed to bed, Fred took one last look at the map. Most of the castle was asleep, dots stationary in their dormitories. But there was movement in Snape's office. He was still awake, probably brewing detection potions. "Game on," Fred whispered, grinning at the challenge. George noticed something else on the map. "Fred, look, that Peter Pettigrew dot is back. in the Gryffindor common room. They hurried to the window overlooking the common room, but it was empty except for dying embers in the fireplace. "Weird?" Lee muttered. "Definitely a malfunction." "We should research the map's creators," George decided. "Maybe find instructions or notes about glitches." "Tomorrow?" Fred yawned. "Tonight, we celebrate. We've got the most powerful tool in Hogwarts and a worthy opponent to test ourselves against." "To the Marauders," George raised an imaginary glass, "may we prove worthy successors to their legacy." "To Weasley's Wizard Wheezes," Lee added, "may Snape never catch us." "To the map," Fred finished, "and all the mayhem it will help us create." As they settled into sleep, none of them could have imagined that the strange dot labelled Peter Pettigrew was more than a malfunction. They didn't know that one of the map's creators was sleeping just a few floors above them, unaware that his greatest creation had found new owners. They couldn't foresee how the map would one day help Harry Potter in ways they'd never dreamed. But, for now, they were 13-year-old entrepreneurs with a magical map, a thriving business, and the absolute certainty that they were living their best lives. Snape could try to catch them, Percy could disapprove, and professors could threaten expulsion. The Weasley twins had the Marauders' map, and with it, they were unstoppable. In the depths of the castle, Severus Snape added another ingredient to his cauldron and smiled grimly. Those troublesome twins thought they were clever, but he'd been dealing with rule breakers since his own school days. He'd caught the Marauders eventually, and he'd catch their spiritual successors too. The game, as young Fred had noted, was definitely on. The spring of 1993 brought more than just blooming flowers and warming weather to Hogwarts. It brought Dolores Jane Umbridge, junior undersecretary to the minister, wearing a pink cardigan that clashed violently with everything in the ancient castle. "What's she doing here?" Lee Jordan whispered, as they watched the squat woman waddle through the entrance hall, clipboard in hand, and a sickeningly sweet smile plastered on her face. "Dunno," Fred replied, consulting the Marauders' map discreetly. "But she's been in Dumbledore's office for the past hour." George frowned. Dad mentioned something about the Ministry getting nervous about unauthorized magical innovations in his last letter. "You don't think—" Before he could finish, Professor McGonagall appeared, looking more stern than usual. "Mr. Weasley, Mr. Weasley, Mr. Jordan, the headmaster wishes to see you immediately." The twins exchanged worried glances. Being summoned to Dumbledore's office was either very good or very bad, with little middle ground. As they climbed the spiral staircase, Fred muttered, "Remember, deny everything." "What if he has evidence?" Lee asked nervously. "Then deny it more creatively," George suggested. Dumbledore's office was as fascinating as ever, filled with whirring silver instruments and portraits of sleeping headmasters. But the atmosphere was tense. Dumbledore sat behind his desk, blue eyes devoid of their usual twinkle. Beside him, Umbridge perched on a chintz-covered chair she'd apparently conjured, looking like a malevolent toad in pink. "Ah, boys," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "Please, have a seat." 3 chairs appeared. They sat cautiously. "Hem, hem." Umbridge cleared her throat in what would become an irritatingly familiar sound. "Mr. Weasley, and Mr. Jordan, I am here on behalf of the Ministry to investigate reports of dangerous magical experimentation and unauthorized commercial activities within the school." "I'm sorry, who are you?" George asked, with polite confusion that didn't fool anyone. Umbridge's smile tightened. "I am Dolores Umbridge, Senior—" "Junior," Dumbledore corrected mildly. Junior Undersecretary to the Minister, she continued through gritted teeth. And I have it on good authority that you three have been manufacturing and distributing unsafe magical items to students. Unsafe? Fred asked, sounding genuinely offended. Our products are thoroughly tested. George kicked him under the chair. So you admit to creating products? Umbridge pounced, quill scratching across her clipboard. Hypothetically speaking, George said quickly, if someone were creating harmless joke products, would that be illegal? The decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery clearly states, Umbridge began, allows for practical magic within school grounds for educational purposes, Dumbledore interrupted smoothly. I believe Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick can attest that Mr. Weasley and Mr. Weasley have been receiving supplemental education in advanced magical theory. McGonagall, who had been standing near the window, nodded stiffly. Their work has been educational. Nevertheless, Umbridge's voice rose to an unpleasant pitch. Commercial activities are strictly prohibited, and I have reports of students being poisoned. No one's been poisoned, Lee protested. The skiving snack boxes are perfectly safe. Fred and George winced. Lee had just confirmed their product line existed. Aha! Umbridge's eyes gleamed triumphantly. So you admit to creating these skiving snack boxes, items designed to help students avoid their educational responsibilities. Technically, Fred said, his mind racing, they're designed to demonstrate the practical applications of transfiguration and potions theory. The fact that students misuse them is hardly our fault. It's like blaming cauldron makers when someone brews a bad potion, George added helpfully. Umbridge's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. Mr. Weasley, both of you, this is exactly the sort of disrespect for authority that... I think, Dumbledore said quietly, but with steel beneath the calm, that we should focus on facts rather than interpretations. Dolores, do you have any evidence that these boys have broken school rules or ministry law? I have testimonies, she pulled out a sheaf of parchment, from concerned students and staff. May I? Dumbledore took the papers, scanning them quickly. His lips twitched. I see. Mr. Filch reports suspicious twin-shaped shadows in corridors. Mrs. Norris apparently meowed accusingly at them. And Peeves claims they stole his idea for toilet seat warming charms, which I rather doubt were his idea to begin with. There's more, Umbridge insisted. Professor Snape has no concrete evidence. Snape's silky voice came from the doorway as he entered. Despite my best efforts, these entrepreneurs have been frustratingly careful. Fred and George tried not to look smug. However, Snape continued, making their smiles falter, I believe a thorough search of their belongings would prove illuminating. An excellent idea, Umbridge chirped. I demand an immediate search of their dormitory and any spaces they frequent. Dumbledore's eyes found the twins over his half-moon spectacles. Boys, I assume you have no objection to proving your innocence? It was masterfully done. By framing it as proving innocence rather than hiding guilt, Dumbledore had given them no choice but to agree. Of course not, George said, his mind frantically calculating what was hidden where. We've nothing to hide, Fred added, mentally cataloguing every secret stash. Excellent. Umbridge stood, clearly expecting to lead the charge immediately. Tomorrow morning, Dumbledore said firmly, it's nearly curfew, and I believe searches should be conducted in daylight, with proper witnesses. Minerva, would you be so kind as to accompany Dolores tomorrow? And perhaps Mr. Filch, since he knows the castle so well." McGonagall nodded, and the twins caught what might have been a warning glance from her. As they were dismissed, Umbridge called after them, "Don't think you can hide anything overnight. I'll have Auras watching the castle." Outside the office, Lee let out a breath he'd been holding. "We're doomed." "We're not doomed," Fred said, though his confident tone was forced. "We just need to move everything, tonight." "Everything?" George calculated quickly. "That's 3 storage rooms, 2 brewing stations, and the emergency stash behind Barnabas the Barmy." "Then we'd better get started," Fred said grimly. They split up to cover more ground, using the map to avoid Umbridge, who, true to her word, was patrolling with 2 stern-looking Auras. Fred took the main storage room, carefully levitating boxes of completed products into an expanded bag they'd bought from a 7th year. But as he worked, a brilliant idea struck him. Why hide everything when they could hide it in plain sight? Racing to find George and Lee, he explained his plan. "We don't hide the products, we hide what they do." "Come again?" Lee asked, confused. "Temporary transfiguration," Fred said excitedly. "Turn the skiving snack boxes into actual sweets. Transform the canary creams into regular cookies. Make everything look innocent." George's eyes lit up. "And after the search—" "We reverse the transfiguration," Fred finished. "Brilliant." They worked through the night, using every bit of magical theory McGonagall had taught them. It was exhausting, complex work. Each product needed to maintain its shape and appearance, while having its magical properties temporarily suppressed. "This one's fighting me," George grunted, wrestling with a particularly stubborn nosebleed nougat. "Try a protean charm base with a timed reversal," Lee suggested, wiping sweat from his forehead. By dawn, they'd transformed their entire inventory. Boxes of dangerous magical items now appeared to be nothing more than poorly made student attempts at confectionery. The search party arrived at precisely 8 o'clock. Umbridge, in even more pink, McGonagall, looking tired, Filch, gleeful, and the 2 Auras, professional. "We'll start with their dormitory," Umbridge announced. The twins watched, nervously, as the adults systematically searched their space. Umbridge cast revealing charms, while the Auras checked for hidden compartments. Filch poked hopefully at loose floorboards. "What's this?" Umbridge held up their business ledger triumphantly. George's heart sank. They'd forgotten about the ledger. But when Umbridge opened it, her face fell. The pages were covered in what appeared to be herbology notes and badly drawn diagrams of plants. "That's my homework journal," Fred said innocently. Lee's quick thinking with illusion charms had saved them. The search continued to the abandoned classroom where Umbridge found their cauldrons and equipment. "Aha!" she cried. "Illegal brewing equipment." "Actually," McGonagall said dryly, "that's the supplementary education station I approved. Note the safety equipment and proper ventilation. Everything is perfectly legal for supervised student use." Umbridge's face was approaching purple again. "And these?" She pointed at the boxes of transformed sweets. "Cooking experiments," George said promptly. "We're trying to recreate our mother's fudge recipe. Haven't quite got it right yet." "Want to try some?" Fred offered, knowing the temporary transfiguration made them taste awful, but otherwise harmless. Umbridge recoiled. "Certainly not." One of the Auras, however, picked up what had been a fainting fancy. "Mind if I check? Standard procedure." The twins held their breath as he bit into it. His face screwed up at the taste. "Merlin, that's terrible. definitely needs work, boys." "We know," Lee said mournfully. "We're not very good at cooking." The search continued for 3 hours. They found nothing incriminating. Every product was successfully disguised, every brewing station appeared educational, and even Filch's certainty began to waver. "This is impossible," Umbridge shrieked finally. "I know they're selling illegal products. The minister himself has received complaints." "Then perhaps," Dumbledore said, having appeared silently in the doorway, "the complaints were exaggerated. Unless you have actual evidence, Dolores, I believe we're done here." "This isn't over," Umbridge promised, pointing a stubby finger at the twins. "I'll be watching you. One slip, just one, and I'll have you expelled and charged with underage magic violations." After she stormed out, McGonagall lingered. "That was impressive spell work," she said quietly. "Temporarily transfiguring objects while maintaining their physical properties. That's NEUT level magic." "We had good teachers," George said honestly. McGonagall almost smiled. "Indeed. However, gentlemen, you should know that Miss Umbridge rarely gives up. She'll be back, and likely with more authority. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative arrangements for your business." After she left, the 3 boys collapsed in exhaustion. "That was too close," Lee groaned. "But we did it," Fred crowed. "We outsmarted the Ministry." "For now," George said soberly. "McGonagall's right. Umbridge won't give up." They spent the next week maintaining perfect behavior, while secretly reversing the transfigurations on their products. Business resumed, though more carefully than ever. Every transaction was monitored via the map, every customer sworn to secrecy. But Umbridge was relentless. She haunted the corridors, interrogated students, and even tried to intercept mail, until Dumbledore firmly reminded her about privacy laws. "We need a statement," Fred decided one evening. "Something to show we won't be intimidated." "What did you have in mind?" George asked, though he was already grinning. "Remember that portable swamp idea? The one we said was too dangerous to test indoors." "Exactly." It took them 3 days to perfect the formula. The result was a masterpiece of magical mischief, a small orb that, when thrown, would create an instant swamp covering approximately 200 square feet. "The beauty is," George explained as they admired their creation, "it's not permanent. It'll disappear after 24 hours. Unless someone tries to remove it magically," Fred added with a wicked grin. "Then it doubles in size." They waited for the perfect moment. It came when Umbridge scheduled a mandatory respect for ministry authority lecture for all students. As hundreds of students filed into the Great Hall, Fred and George positioned themselves strategically. Umbridge stood at the front, pink bow in her hair, preparing to speak about the importance of obeying the ministry. "Now," Lee whispered. "Now," the twins confirmed. 3 portable swamps arced through the air, landing at precise points around Umbridge. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. Murky water burst from the orbs, spreading rapidly across the floor. Lily pads appeared, followed by croaking frogs and buzzing insects. The smell of stagnant water filled the air. Umbridge shrieked as the swamp reached her feet, soaking through her pink shoes. She tried to step back, but slipped on the suddenly slimy floor, landing with a tremendous splash in the muck. "Finite incantatem!" she screamed and waved frantically. The swamp doubled in size. Students scrambled onto benches and tables, though most were laughing too hard to move quickly. Even some teachers seemed to be hiding smiles behind their hands. "Weasley!" Umbridge howled, covered in pondweed and mud. "I know this was you." "Prove it," Fred called cheerfully from his bench. "We've been here the whole time," George added innocently. "Hundreds of witnesses," Lee confirmed. Umbridge's face was practically purple now, clashing horribly with her mud-stained pink outfit. "This is assault, attacking a ministry official. You'll be in Azkaban." Now, Professor Flitwick squeaked, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "No one's been hurt. It's just a bit of water." "And mud," Sprout added helpfully. "Quite nutritious for plants, actually." "And educational," Fred called out. "Think of it as a practical demonstration of environmental transfiguration." It took 6 hours for the staff to partially clear the swamp. They gave up on the section near the staff table after it kept regenerating. Umbridge spent the entire time screaming threats and promises of retribution. But she couldn't prove anything. No one had seen the twins throw the orbs. They'd used a delayed levitation charm, and dozens of students provided alibis. That night, as they celebrated in the common room, Percy approached them with his sternest prefect expression. "That was completely irresponsible," he began. "Come off it, Perce," George grinned. "Even you thought it was funny." "I did not," Percy protested, though his lips twitched. "But really, antagonizing ministry officials? Do you have any idea how this could affect your futures?" "Our future," Fred said confidently, "is in making people laugh. And if the ministry can't handle a little swamp, then they're not ready for what we've got planned next," George finished. Percy sighed. "Just try not to get arrested before graduation." "We'll do our best," the twins promised. The next morning, a letter arrived from their father. "Boys, heard about yesterday's incident. Officially, I'm supposed to tell you to respect ministry authority and behave yourselves. Unofficially, Umbridge has been making everyone at the ministry miserable for years. Be careful. She has connections and a vindictive streak. P.S. Your mother doesn't know about this yet. I'd keep it that way if I were you. Love, Dad." "Dad's brilliant," Fred grinned. "But he's right about being careful," George said. "Umbridge isn't going to let this go." Indeed, over the next week, Umbridge became increasingly desperate. She tried to institute random bag searches. Dumbledore shut that down. Attempted to monitor all student mail. Illegal, without Wizengamot approval. And even suggested using Veritaserum on suspected troublemakers. McGonagall's resulting tirade was legendary. "She's cracking," Lee observed, as they watched her interrogate a first year about suspicious candy consumption. "Good," Fred said. "Maybe she'll give up and go back to the ministry." But George was looking thoughtful. "Or maybe it's time for us to think bigger. Bigger than portable swamps. I mean the business. McGonagall was right. We need alternative arrangements. What if we didn't just sell at Hogwarts?" Fred caught on immediately. "Hogsmeade. We could set up a proper distribution centre." "Use the secret passages to transport goods," Lee added excitedly. "Build a real customer base beyond students," George continued. They looked at each other, the same thought occurring simultaneously. "We're going to need investors," Fred said. "And a lot more products," George added. "And probably someone who actually knows how to run a business," Lee concluded. But they were grinning. Umbridge's interference, rather than crushing their dreams, had forced them to think beyond the castle walls. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes wouldn't just be a school operation. It would be a real business. To Dolores Umbridge, Fred raised an imaginary glass that night, for teaching us that small minds can't stop big dreams. To portable swamps, George added, and the statement they made. To the future, Lee finished, and whatever chaos it brings. As they planned late into the night, none of them noticed the small pink note that appeared on their dormitory door. By order of the Ministry of Magic, these premises are under official surveillance. Any illegal activities will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of magical law. DJ Umbridge Jr. Undersecretary to the Minister, they'd find it in the morning and laugh. After all, what was one more challenge to overcome? They had each other, brilliant minds, and now a genuine enemy to inspire them to greater heights. The Ministry thought they could meddle with the Weasley twins' dreams. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. October arrived at Hogwarts with unusual fanfare. The castle had been scrubbed cleaner than anyone could remember. Suits of armour gleamed, and even Peeves seemed to be on his best behaviour, relatively speaking. The reason for all this preparation became clear when the delegations from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang arrived in spectacular fashion. "Bloody hell," Lee breathed, as the Beauxbatons carriage, pulled by massive winged horses, descended from the sky. "Look at the size of those horses," George marvelled. "Reckon they'd be interested in some specialty animal treats?" "Already thinking about business?" Fred grinned. "I love how your mind works." They watched from the entrance hall as students in powder blue robes emerged from the carriage, followed by the largest woman they'd ever seen. "That's Madame Maxime," Percy informed them importantly, his new head boy badge gleaming. "The Beauxbatons headmistress. She's quite distinguished in educational circles." "She's quite distinguished in all circles," Fred muttered. "Being 12 feet tall will do that." George was studying French students with interest. "Look at them shivering, not used to Scottish weather." "Warming charms," Lee said immediately. "We could sell portable warming charms." "Or hot chocolate that never cools down," Fred suggested. "Or scarves that adjust their temperature automatically," George added. Percy sighed. "Can you three think about anything besides making money?" "No," they answered in unison. The arrival of Durmstrang was even more dramatic, with their ship rising from the depths of the Black Lake like something from a nightmare. The students who emerged looked hardier than their Beauxbatons counterparts, wrapped in thick fur cloaks. "Victor Crumb!" someone shrieked, and suddenly half of Hogwarts was pushing forward to get a better look at the famous seeker. "International Quidditch star," George said thoughtfully. "Massive fan base." "Merchandising opportunities," Fred agreed. "You're not seriously thinking of—" Percy began. "Crumb-themed products," the twins said together. "Collectible chocolate frogs with moving crumb cards," Lee elaborated. "Miniature figures that play actual Quidditch," George continued. "Autographed items, if we can get him to agree," Fred finished. Percy threw up his hands and stalked away, muttering about family embarrassments. At the feast that night, with the Great Hall more crowded than ever, the twins observed their potential new customers carefully. The Beauxbatons students sat at the Ravenclaw table, still looking cold despite the magical fires. The Durmstrang contingent had joined the Slytherins, though Crumb looked supremely uncomfortable with all the attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dumbledore announced, his voice magically amplified, "let me introduce our esteemed judges for the Triwizard Tournament. Mr. Ludo Bagman, head of Magical Games and Sports." A round, boyish-looking man in bright yellow and black Quidditch robes bounded to his feet, waving enthusiastically. The twins exchanged interested glances. The head of magical games and sports could be a valuable contact. After the feast, as students mingled in the entrance hall, Fred spotted an opportunity. Ludo Bagman was holding court near the main doors, regaling a group of students with Quidditch stories. "Mr. Bagman," George called out, pushing through the crowd with Fred and Lee close behind. "Yes, yes?" Bagman turned, his round face beaming. "Ah, Hogwarts students, excited about the tournament?" "Extremely," Fred said smoothly. "But we're actually more interested in your thoughts on sports merchandise innovation." Bagman's eyes lit up with interest. "Merchandise? Well, that's not usually. What kind of merchandise?" George pulled out a prototype from his pocket, a tiny figure of a Quidditch player that, when tapped with a wand, would zoom around performing spectacular moves. "Collectible Quidditch figures," he explained. "Each one charmed me to recreate famous plays. We thought, with the tournament bringing international attention." "Remarkable," Bagman exclaimed, watching the tiny figure execute a perfect Wronski feint. "This is exactly the sort of innovation the sport needs. You boys invented this?" "We're Weasleys Wizard Wheezes," Lee said proudly, "purveyors of magical entertainment and sports memorabilia." "Well, well," Bagman's grin widened. "Entrepreneurial spirit. I like that. Tell you what, boys, I might be interested in investing. Always looking for the next big thing." The twins tried to contain their excitement. An investor, and not just any investor, but someone with ministry connections and sports industry knowledge. "Perhaps we could discuss terms," Fred suggested professionally. "Absolutely." Bagman pulled out a flask from his robes and took a swig. "But first, fancy a flutter in the tournament? I'm giving excellent odds on who will be chosen as champions." "Gambling?" George asked carefully. "Just a friendly wager." Bagman winked. "Between business associates. I've got Crumb at 7-1 to be Durmstrang champion." The twins exchanged glances. They had a strict policy against gambling with business funds, but this was different. This was networking. "What odds are you giving on Hogwarts?" Fred asked. "Depends on who enters." Bagman laughed. "Tell you what, if you boys can show me a proper business plan for these products, I'll give you special insider odds. Deal?" They shook hands enthusiastically. As Bagman wandered off to find more betting partners, Lee whistled low. "Did we just get a potential investor?" "Better," George grinned. "We got a connection to the entire British Quidditch League." Over the next week, they worked feverishly on their business plan, while also developing tournament-themed products. The Goblet of Fire, sitting in its age-lined circle, provided inspiration. "Goblet of Fire replicas," Fred announced during a brainstorming session. "Miniature ones that spit out random fortunes." "Color-changing rosettes," George added, sketching designs. "They shift to match whichever champion you're supporting." "Noisemakers that roar like dragons," Lee contributed, "since that's bound to be one of the tasks." They barely noticed Harry's name emerging from the goblet, too focused on the business opportunity it presented. 4 champions meant 4 times the merchandise possibilities. Their meeting with Bagman took place in an unused classroom. They'd prepared meticulously: product samples, financial projections, even a marketing strategy targeting international markets. "Brilliant!" Bagman exclaimed after their presentation, though the twins noticed he seemed more interested in the flask he kept sipping from than their actual numbers. "Absolutely brilliant. I'll invest, let's say, 1,000 galleons? The twins' eyes widened. That was more than they dared hope for. But, Bagman continued, his eyes taking on a calculating gleam, I'll need a return on my investment. How about 60% of profits? 20%, Fred countered immediately. 50, Bagman shot back. 25, George said firmly. And you get exclusive rights to sell our products at Ministry sporting events. Deal! Bagman shook their hands vigorously. But first, about that wager. He pulled out a betting slip. I'm giving you boys special odds. Harry Potter to win the tournament, 37-1. Imagine the return. The twins hesitated. Betting their investors' money would be supremely irresponsible. Just a small flutter, Bagman pressed. Show faith in your school champion. Tell you what, bet 10 galleons, and if you win, I'll introduce you to every Quidditch team manager in Britain. It was too tempting. The connections alone would be worth thousands in future sales. 10 galleons, George agreed carefully. On Harry to win. Excellent. Bagman scribbled out a receipt. Now, let's see those products. They spent the next hour demonstrating their tournament line. Bagman was particularly taken with the miniature dragons that breathed harmless coloured smoke. These'll sell like hotcakes at the first task, he declared. You boys are sitting on a gold mine. But as November approached and the first task loomed, the twins noticed something odd about their investor. Bagman seemed increasingly distracted, often disappearing when they tried to schedule meetings. His initial investment had arrived, eventually, but in installments rather than the lump sum promised. Something's off, Lee muttered, as they watched Bagman literally run away from a group of goblins in the entrance hall. He owes people money, George realized. Look at how he's avoiding everyone. Fred frowned. You don't think he bet our investment, do you? They confronted him the night before the first task, cornering him near the Quidditch pitch. Boys, Bagman said with false cheer, all ready for tomorrow? Got those dragon souvenirs prepared? Mr. Bagman, George said seriously, we need to talk about our investment. Investment's fine, Bagman said quickly. All accounted for. Say, fancy increasing that bet on Potter? I'll give you 50-1 now. We want documentation, Fred said firmly. Proof that our money is secure. Bagman's face went pale. Now, boys, no need for all that paperwork. We're partners. Trust is the foundation of good business. So is transparency, Lee added coldly. Tell you what, Bagman said desperately. Harry wins tomorrow. I'll double your investment. Guaranteed return. And if he doesn't? George asked. Bagman didn't answer, instead mumbling about needing to check on task preparations and hurrying away. We're in trouble, Fred said flatly. Maybe not, George said thoughtfully. We've still got the products. Even if Bagman's broke, we can sell directly. The first task dawned cold and clear. The twins had set up a small stall near the champion's tent, technically not breaking any rules, since they were on the grounds, rather than in the castle. Their dragon-themed merchandise was an instant hit. Dragon dolls! Get your collectible dragon dolls here, Lee called out. Each one breathes real coloured smoke. Champion rosettes, Fred advertised. Show your support in style. The foreign students were particularly eager customers. The Beauxbatons contingent bought warming scarves by the dozen, while Durmstrang students seemed fascinated by the miniature firebolts that actually flew. 20 galleons in an hour, George counted with satisfaction. And the task hasn't even started. They watched in awe as Harry faced the Hungarian horntail, their hearts in their throats, as he summoned his firebolt and outflowed the dragon. The crowd went wild, and suddenly everyone wanted Harry Potter merchandise. "We need more stock," Fred said urgently, as their Harry-themed items sold out within minutes. "Already on it," Lee replied, sending a coded message via enchanted parchment to their storage sites. After the task, as celebrations continued, they found Bagman practically dancing with joy. "He did it!" Bagman exclaimed. "Potter's tied for first. Our bet's looking good, boys." "About that investment," George began. Later. Bagman waved them off. "A big opportunity just came up. Goblins are offering incredible odds on the second task. If I can just leverage... if we can maximize our portfolio." He hurried off, leaving the twins deeply concerned. "He's going to lose everything," Fred said quietly, "including our money." "Then we need to protect ourselves," George decided. "From now on, cash only. No credit, no promises." They spent the rest of November and December expanding their operation. With international students as customers, demand had skyrocketed. They developed translation charms for their products, created culture-specific items, singing berets for Beaubaton, miniature ships for Durmstrang, and even managed to get Victor Crumb to autograph a limited run of figures. Revenues up 400%, Lee reported at their last meeting before the Christmas holidays. Even without Bagman's full investment, we're profitable. "And sustainable," George added. "We're not dependent on him anymore." "Speaking of Bagman," Fred said, checking the Marauder's map, "he's hiding in the trophy room again. Those goblins must really want their money." They found him there, looking haggard and desperate. "Boys," he said with clearly forced enthusiasm, "just the entrepreneurs I wanted to see. How about a Christmas special? Bet everything on Potter for the tournament win. I'll give you 100 to 1. "Mr. Bagman," George said firmly, "we want out." "Out?" Bagman's face fell. But we're partners." "We'll forgive the remaining investment you owe," Fred said, "in exchange for a clean break. No more partnership, no more bets." "But the connections I promised, we'll make our own," Lee interrupted. "We've already had inquiries from Zonkos about stocking our products." Bagman deflated like a punctured balloon. "You're making a mistake. When I win big on Potter..." "If," George corrected. "And even if Harry wins, we suspect you owe more than you could ever pay back." They left him in the trophy room, muttering about sure things and house odds. It was hard to feel too sorry for him. His gambling had nearly cost them everything. Back in their dormitory, they revised their business plan. "No more outside investors," Fred declared. "We fund ourselves." "Agreed," George said. "And we focus on sustainable growth. The tournament brought us international attention. We need to capitalize on that." "I've been writing to my cousin in France," Lee added. "He thinks there's a market for British novelty items there. We could expand internationally." They worked through the night, planning and plotting. The Bagman debacle had taught them valuable lessons about trust and the dangers of easy money. But it had also shown them their own capabilities. They'd survived a bad investor, adapted to international markets, and proven their products had universal appeal. "You know what the best part is?" George said as dawn broke over the castle. "What's that?" Fred asked, looking up from their revised financial projections. "We're only 6th years," George grinned. "Imagine what we'll accomplish by graduation." "Weasleys Wizard Wheezes International," Lee said dreamily. "Shops in every magical community." "Products in multiple languages," Fred added. "Our own Quidditch team sponsorship," George continued. Steady on, Fred laughed. Let's survive the rest of the tournament first. The second task came and went, with the twins making steady profits from their underwater-themed products. Gillyweed gum that let you blow bubbles shaped like fish was particularly popular. They kept half an eye on Bagman, who was looking increasingly desperate as his debts mounted. The night before the third task, he approached them one last time. "Boys," he said, and they'd never seen him look so defeated. "I know we're not partners anymore, but any chance you could spot me a few galleons, just until Potter wins, and I can pay everyone back?" The twins exchanged glances. Despite everything, they felt a twinge of pity. "Mr. Bagman," George said gently, "Harry winning won't solve your problems. You need help, not another bet." "Maybe talk to someone at the ministry," Fred suggested. "They have programs for financial difficulties." Bagman laughed bitterly. "The head of magical games and sports admitting he's broke. I'd be ruined." "You're already ruined," Lee pointed out. "But you could rebuild. Honestly, this time." They gave him 5 galleons, not as a bet, but as a meal fund. It was probably pointless, but they couldn't let him starve. The third task was their most profitable event yet. Their maze-themed products, colour-changing thread that helped you track where you'd been, miniature Sphinx dolls that asked riddles, sold out completely. They watched Harry and Cedric disappear into the maze with the same nervousness as everyone else. When Harry returned with Cedric's body, everything changed. The celebration atmosphere evaporated. Their products suddenly seemed frivolous, inappropriate. They quietly packed up their stall, revenues forgotten in the face of tragedy. "Voldemort's back," Fred said quietly as they sat in their dormitory later that night. "Everything's going to change," George agreed. "Our products," Lee began, then stopped. What was the point of joke products in the face of returning darkness? But George was thinking, "No, this is when people need laughter most, when things are darkest." "We're not giving up," Fred said firmly. "If anything, we work harder, give people reasons to smile. And maybe," George added thoughtfully, "we start thinking about products that could help. Defense items, communication tools." "The joke shop that helped win a war," Lee said, managing a small smile. They stayed up late, not planning products, but processing the shift in their world. The tournament had brought them international recognition and hard lessons about business. But it had also shown them that their work, bringing joy and laughter, might be more important than they'd ever imagined. As the castle slowly came to terms with Cedric's death and Voldemort's return, 3 young entrepreneurs quietly resolved to continue their mission. The wizarding world would need laughter in the dark times ahead, and Weasley's Wizard Wheezes would be there to provide it. The summer of 1995 began unlike any other. Instead of the burrow's familiar chaotic warmth, Fred and George found themselves in the gloomy confines of number 12 Grimmauld Place. The noble and most ancient House of Black was as depressing as its name was pretentious, all mouldy curtains and screaming portraits. "This place is cheerful," George muttered, dodging a pair of scuttling severed house elf heads mounted on the wall. "Positively festive," Fred agreed, grimacing at the layer of dust coating everything. Perfect headquarters for a secret organization. They'd been inducted into the Order of the Phoenix just 3 days ago, the youngest members ever admitted. Dumbledore himself had argued for their inclusion, citing their unique talents and proven discretion. Their mother had protested vehemently until Moody had growled something about needing every able wand, especially clever ones. Still can't believe Mum agreed, George said as they climbed the creaking stairs to their assigned room. She didn't have much choice after we pointed out we're of age, Fred replied. Plus, I think Dad's been working on her. He knows we'd just find ways to help anyway. Their room was on the 3rd floor, next to where Buckbeak the Hippogriff was being kept. They could hear him shifting restlessly through the thin walls. Right, George said, dumping his trunk on one of the moth-eaten beds. We need to get to work. Defensive products, Fred agreed, pulling out their ever-present notebooks. Actual useful ones, not just jokes. They'd started developing the concept on the train home from Hogwarts. If Voldemort was truly back, people would need protection. And who better to provide it than the twins who'd spent years perfecting magical mischief? Shield hats, George said, sketching rapidly. Fashionable and functional. Blocks minor hexes and jinxes. Peruvian instant darkness powder, Fred added, for quick escapes. No light can penetrate it. Decoy detonators, Lee's voice came from the doorway. He'd arrived with his grandmother, who was apparently an old friend of Mad Eye Moody. Create diversions, draw fire away from the user. They worked through the afternoon, the oppressive atmosphere of the house spurring rather than hindering their creativity. By evening, they had a comprehensive list of defensive products to develop. The first order meeting they were allowed to attend was eye-opening. The kitchen was packed with witches, wizards. Some they recognized. Professor McGonagall, looking stern as ever. Others they didn't. A young witch with violently pink hair who winked at them. "That's Tonks," their brother Bill whispered. "Auror, Mad Eye's protege." "Watcher, Weasley squared," Tonks called out cheerfully, her hair shifting to match their red. "Heard you two are the family troublemakers." "Entrepreneurs," George corrected with dignity. "Innovators," Fred added. "Right," Moody growled from across the table, his magical eye fixed on them. "Let's see how innovative you are. Order needs secure communication methods. The Ministry's monitoring all official channels." The twins exchanged glances. They'd been working on something. "Extendable ears," George said promptly, "for short-range eavesdropping. But we could modify them." "Create a paired set," Fred continued seamlessly. "What one end hears, the other transmits. Distance unlimited." "Undetectable by standard monitoring charms," George added. "Since they're not technically magical communication, just enhanced hearing." Moody's scarred face split into what might have been a grin. "Do it. By next week." "Consider it done," the twins said in unison. The meeting continued with reports from various members. Snape, looking even more sour than usual, reported on Death Eater movements. Lupin discussed werewolf pact negotiations. Mundungus Fletcher mumbled something about black market surveillance that had their mother pursing her lips disapprovingly. "And now," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes serious behind half-moon spectacles, "to the matter of protecting Harry." The twins learned about the blood protection on Privet Drive, the rotation of guards, the concern about Harry's isolation. An idea began forming in their minds. After the meeting, they cornered Lupin in the hallway. "Professor," Fred began. "Former Professor," Lupin corrected gently. "Just Remus now." "Remus," George continued, "we have a proposition. Harry needs contact with the wizarding world, right? But it has to be subtle." "What did you have in mind?" Lupin asked, though his eyes held wary amusement. "Owl Order Catalogue," Fred explained, "for our products. Looks like junk mail to muggles, but it would let Harry know he's not forgotten." "And if we included some special items?" George added meaningfully. Things that might help if he's attacked? Lupin considered this. It would have to pass the mundane inspection. Nothing obviously magical. Leave that to us, the twins said confidently. They spent the next week in a frenzy of invention. The modified extendable ears were completed in 3 days, much to Moody's grumbling approval. They created what looked like ordinary strings, but could transmit sound perfectly across any distance. The beauty is, George explained to an impressed Tonks, they're nearly undetectable. Who's going to notice a bit of string? But their real triumph was the catalogue for Harry. Every page was jewel-layered. Muggles would see advertisements for joke items, while anyone magical would see the real products. They included defensive items, disguised as pranks, emergency portkeys that looked like ordinary buttons, and even a two-way mirror hidden in what appeared to be a compact. Brilliant, Sirius Black declared when they showed him. He'd taken an immediate liking to the twins, recognizing kindred spirits. Reminds me of my Hogwarts days. James and I would have loved this stuff. You were one of the marauders, George said. It wasn't a question. Sirius's eyes widened slightly. How did you... We might have acquired a certain map, Fred said carefully, previously confiscated by Filch. The map? Sirius's face lit up with genuine delight. You have the Marauders map? Oh, that's perfect. Moony, get in here. Lupin appeared, looking puzzled, until Sirius explained. A slow smile spread across his tired face. So you're the ones giving Filch grief these days, he said. We'd be honoured to pass the torch officially. They spent hours sharing stories, the older marauders teaching the twins advanced tricks while learning about their modern innovations. It was the brightest spot in an increasingly dark summer, but reality intruded all too soon. News of Dementor attacks reached them daily. Order members returned from missions injured or discouraged, and their mother's protective instincts went into overdrive. You're too young for field work, Mrs. Weasley declared, after catching them trying to volunteer for a guard shift. Mum, we're 17, George began. Barely, she interrupted. And being of age doesn't mean you're ready for Death Eaters. But our products could help, Fred argued. We need field testing. Absolutely not. Their mother's voice rose to a pitch that set the portrait of Sirius's mother screaming. It took 20 minutes to quiet Mrs. Black's portrait and calm their mother. But the twins weren't ready to give up. Fine, George said once she'd left. We'll test them here. Indoor testing of defensive products? Fred grinned. What could go wrong? What could go wrong, as it turned out, was quite a lot. Their first test of Peruvian instant darkness powder in the drawing room resulted in 3 hours of absolute blackness that no spell could penetrate. They'd neglected to create an off switch. I can't see anything. Ron's voice came from somewhere near the fireplace. That's rather the point, Fred called back. The effect was supposed to last 30 seconds, George protested. Well, it doesn't, Ginny snapped from near the door. Fix it. It took Dumbledore himself to dispel the darkness, and he did so with an amused twinkle in his eye that suggested he knew exactly who was responsible. Their shield cloaks were more successful, managing to block everything from stunning spells to Hermione's rather vicious bat bogey hex she'd volunteered to test for academic purposes. The only drawback was the cloak's tendency to billow dramatically with every blocked spell. You look like vampire bats, Tonks laughed after a demonstration. Dramatic vampire bats, Sirius corrected. Very intimidating. We're working on subtlety, George said defensively. But subtlety took a back seat to functionality as the summer wore on. News from the outside grew grimmer. Harry had been attacked by Dementors in Little Whinging and faced expulsion for defending himself. The Ministry was actively campaigning against Dumbledore, and recruitment for both sides of the conflict was accelerating. "We need to think bigger," Fred said one evening after a particularly sobering order meeting. "Individual protection isn't enough." "Area effects," George agreed. "Portable shields that protect multiple people." "Communication networks," Lee added. "If the Ministry's compromised, the Order needs alternatives." They worked with renewed urgency, often pulling all-nighters in their makeshift laboratory, much to their mother's vocal disapproval. Sirius helped when he could, his knowledge of advanced magic proving invaluable. "You remind me of us," he said one night, watching them modify a batch of decoy detonators. "James and we thought we could save the world with clever spellwork and good intentions." "Did you?" George asked quietly. Sirius's face darkened. "We tried, but cleverness isn't always enough. Sometimes the world doesn't want to be saved." "Then you save the parts you can," Fred said firmly, "one person at a time if necessary." Sirius smiled sadly. "Wisdom beyond your years. Hold on to that optimism, boys. We're going to need it." The night before Harry's hearing, tension in Grimmauld Place reached a breaking point. Order members came and went at all hours. Voices were constantly raised, and their mother had resorted to stress cooking enough food to feed a small army. "I hate this," George muttered, pacing their room. "Sitting here while Harry faces the entire Ministry alone." "Dumbledore's with him," Fred reminded him, though he was equally restless. Still, George pulled out their ledger, now expanded to include defensive product development notes. "We need to accelerate production. If Harry's expelled, if the Ministry continues this propaganda campaign—" "They will," Lee said grimly. "My gran says Fudge is terrified. Terrified people do stupid things." "Then we'll be smart," Fred decided. "We've got 2 weeks before school. 2 weeks to create a full defensive line." They threw themselves into the work with manic energy. Shield hats were perfected, capable of blocking everything up to moderate dark curses. Instant darkness powder was refined with a built-in timer. They created portable swamps specifically designed to slow pursuit, and developed a line of clothing with built-in protective charms. "The Ministry won't recognize these as defensive items," George explained to a gathering of Order members. "They look like joke products, but each one could save a life." "Clever," Moody growled, approvingly. "Hidden in plain sight. Real Aura thinking that." "We're also working on this." Fred produced what looked like an ordinary piece of parchment. "Emergency communication system. Write on one, message appears on all linked parchments." "Like Tom Riddle's diary?" someone asked nervously. "No," George said firmly. "No personality, no possession. Just simple message transmission, completely safe." Dumbledore examined the parchment carefully. "Impressive work, gentlemen. I believe the Order will be placing a substantial commission." The twins beamed, but their joy was tempered by the circumstances. This wasn't about profit anymore. It was about survival. Harry's return from his hearing brought relief, not expelled, but also frustration. The Ministry was clearly campaigning against him and Dumbledore. The Daily Prophet printed lies daily, and Voldemort remained frustratingly quiet, letting the Ministry do his work for him. "We need our own propaganda," Fred declared after reading yet another Prophet article claiming Harry was delusional. Fight lies with truth. How? Hermione asked. She'd been helping test their products, bringing her encyclopedic knowledge of spellwork to bear on improvements. The Prophet won't print anything supportive. Then we bypass them, George said slowly. Create our own distribution network. Start small. Hogwarts students. They trust Harry. Get them on side. Their families follow. A grassroots campaign, Hermione breathed, eyes lighting up. That's brilliant. They spent their last days at Grimmauld Place planning. They'd return to Hogwarts with more than just joke products. They'd bring a complete defensive line and the beginnings of an information network. You've grown up, their mother said the night before they left, finding them working on a batch of shield cloaks. Her voice was soft, sad. When did my little troublemakers become soldiers? We're not soldiers, Mum, George said gently. We're suppliers, morale officers. Agents of chaos in the service of good, Fred added, with a weak grin. She hugged them tightly. Just be careful. Both of you. I couldn't bear it. We will, they promised. But as they packed their expanded trunks with defensive products and communication devices, they knew being careful wasn't really in their nature. The wizarding world was at war, whether the Ministry admitted it or not. And Weasley's Wizard Wheezes was about to become a crucial part of the resistance. Ready? George asked as they prepared to leave for King's Cross. Ready, Fred confirmed. Time to show Umbridge what real troublemakers can do. They didn't know yet that Umbridge would be at Hogwarts, implementing increasingly draconian rules. They didn't know about the DA or the battles to come, or the sacrifice that would tear them apart. But they knew they had each other, brilliant minds, and products that could make a difference. In a world sliding toward darkness, the Weasley twins were prepared to be dealers of hope, one shield hat at a time. The morning of September 1st dawned grey and drizzly. As they loaded their trunks onto the night bus, the Order deemed it safer than the Hogwarts Express, Fred took one last look at number 12, Grimmauld Place. We'll be back for Christmas, George said, reading his thoughts. Different people than we are now, Fred observed. Better people, George corrected. Stronger. More profitable, Lee added, making them all laugh. As the night bus lurched into motion, throwing them against the windows, they held tight to their expanded bags full of defensive products. They were 17, brilliant, and ready to take on the world, or at least ready to supply those who would. The April morning dawned bright and clear over Hogwarts, a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled over the wizarding world. Fred and George Weasley stood in their dormitory, surrounded by trunks packed not for summer holiday, but for a permanent departure. 7 years, George said quietly, looking around the familiar room. Well, 6 3/4. Best 6 3/4 years of mischief Hogwarts has ever seen, Fred replied, though his usual jovial tone was tinged with nostalgia. Lee Jordan sat on his bed, watching them pack the last of their belongings. I still can't believe you're actually doing it, leaving school to open a shop in the middle of a war. Precisely because there's a war, George corrected, carefully wrapping their original business ledger. People need laughter now more than ever. And defensive products, Fred added, securing a box of shield hats. The Ministry won't provide them, so we will. The past months under Umbridge's regime had been simultaneously the most challenging and most profitable of their Hogwarts career. Her increasingly draconian rules had created a desperate market for both escape and rebellion. Their skiving snack boxes had evolved from simple illness simulators to sophisticated escape tools. Students used them not just to skip classes, but to avoid Umbridge's sadistic detentions. "Remember when she tried to ban Weasley products by name?" Lee grinned. "So we rebranded everything." George smiled at the memory. "Suddenly, we were selling Gryffindor courage drops and Hufflepuff hard candies." "Ravenclaw brain boosters," Fred continued. "Even got some Slytherins buying ambition assistant sweets." They turned Umbridge's authoritarianism into a business opportunity, but more importantly, they'd given students ways to resist. Their products had become symbols of defiance, little acts of rebellion that kept spirits up during the darkest days. "The DA wouldn't have been half as successful without your Peruvian instant darkness powder," Lee pointed out. "How many times did that save us from the inquisitorial squad?" 23, the twins said in unison. They kept careful track of their products' real-world applications. A knock at the door interrupted. They're reminiscing. Harry Potter entered, looking older than his 15 years, the weight of leading Dumbledore's army evident in his bearing. "Heard you were leaving today," he said quietly. "Afraid so," Fred replied. "Can't learn anything more from this place. Time to put our education to practical use." Harry reached into his robes and pulled out a heavy bag. "Your investment, the Triwizard winnings. I told you I didn't want it." George pushed the bag back. "And we told you that's startup capital, already accounted for in our business plan. Besides," Fred added with a grin, "you'll get free products for life. Well worth 1,000 galleons when you consider our pricing structure." Harry's smile was small but genuine. "Just be careful out there. Diagon Alley isn't as safe as it used to be." "When has safety ever been our concern?" George asked cheerfully. "We've got defensive products even the Order doesn't know about yet," Fred added with a wink. "Speaking of which..." He handed Harry a small package. "Latest prototype. Emergency portkey disguised as a chocolate frog card. Squeeze it 3 times and it'll bring you straight to our shop." "Assuming we actually get to the shop," George added, still negotiating with the landlord. After Harry left, they resumed packing, each item carefully catalogued and stored. Their years at Hogwarts had been one long research and development phase. Now it was time for full production. "You know what I'll miss most?" Lee asked suddenly. "The food," Fred suggested. "The captive customer base," George offered. "McGonagall's face when she tries not to smile at our pranks," Lee said. They all laughed, remembering the numerous times their head of house had struggled to maintain stern disapproval while clearly fighting amusement. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Professor McGonagall appeared in their doorway. "Mr. Weasley, Mr. Weasley, a word?" They followed her to her office, expecting a final lecture about the inadvisability of leaving school early. Instead, she sat behind her desk and studied them with an unreadable expression. "I suppose nothing I say will change your minds?" she asked finally. "Sorry, Professor," George said, "but our minds are made up." "We've learned everything we can here," Fred added. "Time to apply it." McGonagall sighed, then did something unexpected. She smiled. "I suspected as much, which is why I prepared this." She handed them an official-looking document. "What is it?" George asked, scanning the parchment. "A letter of recommendation," McGonagall replied, "for your business license application. The Ministry requires character references for new magical businesses. I thought having the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts vouch for you might expedite the process." The twins stared at her in shock. "Professor," Fred began, unusually lost for words. "You're supporting our joke shop," George finished. "I'm supporting two of the most innovative magical minds I've taught in 40 years, McGonagall corrected. "Who happens to channel their brilliance into making people laugh? In times like these, Mr. Weasley, that's not just a business. It's a public service." She stood, indicating the meeting was over. But as they reached the door, she spoke again. "Your shield hats saved a third year from a nasty curse last week. The attacker thought it was just a fashion statement. Didn't expect it to reflect his own hex back at him." "Did it work properly?" George asked eagerly. "We've been wondering about the reflection capability." "Perfectly," McGonagall assured him, "though perhaps work on making them less flamboyant." The shower of golden sparks rather gave away magical protection. "Noted," Fred grinned. "Version 2.0 will be more subtle." "I'm sure it will be." Her expression softened. "Take care of yourselves, boys. The world needs laughter, yes, but it needs you alive to provide it." They left her office in thoughtful silence, the weight of her words settling over them. This wasn't just about pranks anymore. They were entering a war zone with products that could save lives. "No pressure," Lee muttered, as they walked back to pack the last of their things. The Great Hall was buzzing with breakfast chatter when they entered for their final meal at Hogwarts. Word had spread about their imminent departure, and students from all houses kept approaching their table. "Is it true?" a second-year Hufflepuff asked anxiously. "You're leaving? But who'll sell us canary creams?" "Owl order," George assured her. "We'll have a catalogue out within the month." "With special Hogwarts student discounts," Fred added. A group of Ravenclaws presented them with a list. "Bulk order," their spokesperson explained. "We're planning an end-of-year celebration and want to stock up." Even some Slytherins approached, though more cautiously. "Hypothetically," one said carefully, "if someone wanted defensive products that couldn't be traced back to the purchaser." "Hypothetically," Fred replied, "we'd suggest looking for our upcoming anonymous owl order option, cash on delivery, no names recorded." The Slytherin nodded and slipped away, but not before leaving a small bag of galleons on the table. "Down payment," he murmured, "for hypothetical future purchases." "The customer base is loyal," Lee observed, making notes. "We should definitely prioritize the mail order system." "Already on it," George said. "Bill's helping us set up an unplottable delivery network, completely secure." But the celebratory atmosphere couldn't last. Umbridge swept into the Great Hall, her pink cardigan especially virulent in the morning light. "Mr. Weasley and Mr. Weasley," she simpered, her voice like poisoned honey. "I hear you're abandoning your education. How expected." "Not abandoning," Fred corrected pleasantly. "Graduating early to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities." "Dropping out," Umbridge insisted, her smile widening. "Like common delinquents. You're poor. Mother must be so ashamed." "Actually," George said, pulling out a letter, "she sent us this." He cleared his throat and read, "My dear boys, while I wish you would finish your formal education, I couldn't be prouder of the young men you've become. Your father and I fully support your business venture. Love, Mum." "P.S.," Fred continued, taking the letter. "Give Dolores my regards. Tell her I remember her from the ministry. Such a shame about that incident with the centaurs at her last job." Umbridge's face went white, then purple. How dare! We should go, George said brightly, standing. Big day ahead, lots of packing, swamps to set off. What? Umbridge shrieked. Nothing, the twins said innocently. They spent the rest of the morning making final preparations. Their plan for leaving was ambitious, even by their standards. They decided that if they were going to leave Hogwarts, they'd do it in a way that would be remembered for generations. Portable swamp in the East Corridor, Lee confirmed, checking their list. Primed and ready, George nodded. Triggered to activate at exactly 2:30. Fireworks in the Great Hall? Time delayed for maximum impact, Fred grinned. Should go off right in the middle of Umbridge's speech. The piece de resistance? They looked at their masterwork. A massive, magically enhanced firework dragon that would chase Umbridge through the castle, before exploding into a shower of spark words spelling out, Weasleys Wizard Wheezes, coming soon to Diagon Alley. It's beautiful, Lee said reverently. It's a revolution, George corrected. It's really going to annoy Umbridge, Fred added happily. At precisely 2 p.m, they stood in the entrance hall with their packed trunks and broomsticks. A crowd had gathered. Word of their departure had spread, and it seemed half the school wanted to witness it. Ready, Fred? Ready, George? They mounted their brooms as the first explosions echoed from the East Corridor. Umbridge's shriek of rage was audible even from the entrance hall. What is the meaning? She began, bursting through the doors. Then she saw the twins on their brooms. You! Stop! Immediately! Sorry, Professor, Fred called cheerfully. We've got a business to run. Places to go, George added. Products to sell, they said together. They kicked off just as the Great Hall erupted in magical fireworks. Catherine wheels spun through the air. Rockets bounced off walls, and sparklers wrote rude messages about educational decree number whatever they were up to now. Stop them! Umbridge screamed. But the gathered students seemed curiously unable to move out of the twins' flight path. As they soared through the entrance doors, Fred released the dragon. It roared to life, 20 feet of sparkling scales and fire, and immediately focused on Umbridge with predatory interest. The last thing they heard as they flew over the grounds was Umbridge's terrified screaming and the thunderous applause of hundreds of students. Think we made an impression, George shouted over the wind. Definitely going in the history books, Fred replied. They flew hard for hours, adrenaline keeping them going long past the point of exhaustion. As the sun began to set, the familiar crooked outline of Diagon Alley appeared before them. Number 93. Diagon Alley stood empty, its windows dark and inviting. They'd signed the lease last week, using Harry's investment as collateral. It was perfect, large enough for a shop floor and workshop, with living quarters above. Home sweet home, George said as they landed. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes headquarters, Fred corrected. They spent the night unpacking, setting up displays, and preparing for the grand opening they'd planned in 3 days. Word of their spectacular exit from Hogwarts had already spread. They could hear excited chatter from late-night Diagon Alley shoppers. We'll need to hire help, George said, reviewing their inventory. Can't run the shop and keep up with production ourselves. Already got applications, Fred said, pulling out a stack of letters. Apparently, working for us is considered cool now. We are pretty cool, George agreed modestly. The coolest, Fred confirmed. But as they worked through the night, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were 17 years old, in the middle of a war, betting everything on a joke shop. Their parents were in the Order, their siblings in danger, and dark wizards roamed freely. "Scared?" George asked quietly as they took a break, sitting among boxes of their creations. "Terrified," Fred admitted. "You?" "Same." George picked up a shield hat, examining the invisible magical weaving. "But we're doing the right thing. People need this. Need hope, laughter, protection. And we'll give it to them," Fred said firmly. "One canary cream at a time." A knock at the door interrupted them. Wands drawn, they approached cautiously. The war had made everyone paranoid. "It's us," a familiar voice called. "Let us in before someone sees." They opened the door to find Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Neville, and Luna standing on their doorstep, all grinning and carrying packages. "Thought you could use some help setting up," Hermione said. "And we brought housewarming presents," Luna added dreamily, holding up what appeared to be a turnip. "It's a blessing from the Quibbler," she explained at their confused looks. "Daddy says it keeps away raxperts. Very important for new businesses." They worked together through the night, the shop taking shape under many willing hands. Harry and Ron set up the defensive products display. "Make it prominent," Fred instructed. "People need to know we're serious about protection." Hermione organized the inventory system with frightening efficiency. Ginny and Luna decorated, their combined efforts resulting in a cheerfully chaotic aesthetic that perfectly captured the Weasley twin spirit. "It's perfect," George said as dawnlight filtered through the windows, illuminating shelves packed with colourful products. "It's just the beginning," Fred corrected, but he was smiling. Neville held up one of their latest creations, a plant that sang insulting songs at passers-by. "This is brilliant. Gran would hate it." "That's rather the point," George grinned. As their friends prepared to return to Hogwarts, sneaking back in would be half the fun, Ron insisted. Harry pulled the twins aside. "I wanted to say thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for the products or the laughs, for showing us that fighting back doesn't always mean violence. Sometimes it means joy." "Deep thoughts from the chosen one," Fred teased, but gently. "We're all choosing," Harry replied seriously. "You chose to spread happiness in dark times. That's its own kind of courage." After they left, the twins stood in their completed shop, surrounded by the work of years of experimentation, failure, and triumph. "We did it," George said wonderingly. "We started it," Fred corrected. "Now we build it into something magnificent." A tapping at the window revealed an official-looking owl. The letter it carried bore the ministry seal. "Dear Mr. F. Weasley and Mr. G. Weasley," George read. "The Ministry of Magic is pleased to approve your business license application for Weasleys Wizard Wheezes. However, given the nature of your products, monthly inspections will be required." "Umbridge," Fred said flatly. "Definitely Umbridge," George agreed. "She's trying to shut us down before we start." "Then we'd better give her something worth inspecting," Fred grinned. They spent the remaining days before the grand opening in a frenzy of preparation. Products were tested and retested. Safety warnings were added, in tiny print that expanded when someone tried to misuse items. They even created a special Ministry Inspector Special. Products that looked dangerous, but were completely harmless, designed to waste hours of inspection time. The morning of the grand opening, they stood before their shop in the purple robes they'd chosen as their signature look. A crowd had already gathered, eager to see what the infamous Weasley twins had created. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fred called out, "welcome to Weasley's Wizard Wheezes." Where mayhem meets merchandise, George added. Where laughter conquers fear. Where your gold becomes our gold. Fred, George muttered. Right, scratch that last one, Fred grinned. Where every purchase comes with a guarantee of mischief. They opened the doors, and the crowd surged in. Within minutes, the shop was packed with customers examining everything from skiving snack boxes to shield cloaks. This is incredible, a young witch breathed, watching a miniature model of their dragon fireworks chase a tiny pink-robed figure around a display case. Based on real events, George told her proudly. An elderly wizard examined the defensive products with professional interest. These shield hats, they really work. Tested against everything up to moderate dark curses, Fred confirmed. Though we recommend running from anything stronger. I'll take a dozen, the wizard said immediately. For my family. As the day wore on, the twins could barely keep up with demand. They'd prepared for success. But the reality exceeded even their optimistic projections. We're going to need those employees sooner than planned, George panted, restocking the Peruvian instant darkness powder for the 5th time. And a bigger shop, Fred added, manning the register where a line stretched out the door. But they were grinning. This was what they'd dreamed of, worked for, sacrificed their formal education to achieve. As afternoon faded to evening, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Dolores Umbridge, flanked by 2 ministry officials, pushed through the crowd. "Inspection," she announced shrilly. "Everyone out. This establishment is under investigation." The crowd grumbled, but began to file out. The twins, however, just smiled. "Of course, Madam Inspector," George said politely. "Right this way. We've prepared a special section just for ministry inspections," Fred added. They led her to a corner filled with their decoy products. Umbridge's eyes gleamed with malicious triumph as she began examining items that appeared highly dangerous, but were actually completely harmless. "What does this do?" she demanded, holding up what looked like a sinister black orb. "That's our darkness daydream charm," George said smoothly. "Gives the user pleasant nighttime visions." "Completely safe," Fred added. "Want to try it?" "Certainly not," Umbridge snapped, making frantic notes. "And this?" She pointed at a violent-looking orange potion. "Pumpkin juice enhancer," the twins said together. "Makes any beverage taste like October." For 2 hours, Umbridge searched desperately for something illegal, immoral, or even slightly objectionable. But the twins had prepared too well. Every dangerous-looking item had a harmless purpose. Every suspicious product came with full ministry-approved documentation. Finally, frustrated and furious, Umbridge was forced to admit defeat. "This inspection is concluded," she spat, "but I'll be back." "We'll look forward to it," Fred said cheerfully. "We'll even save you some pumpkin juice enhancer," George offered. As she stormed out, the crowd flooded back in, many having waited patiently outside. Word of the twins' successful handling of Umbridge spread quickly, adding to their reputation. "That was brilliant," a young wizard exclaimed. "You completely fooled her." "We aim to please," George said modestly. "And annoy authority figures," Fred added. "It's a package deal." As closing time approached, they tallied the day's receipts with growing amazement. They'd sold more in one day than they'd projected for their first week. "We can hire help tomorrow," George said. "Maybe even start expanding the product line." "Definitely need to increase production," Fred agreed. "At this rate, we'll be sold out by next week." They locked the shop and climbed the stairs to their flat, exhausted but exhilarated. From their window, they could see Diagon Alley settling into evening quiet, though several people still lingered outside their shop, peering in the windows at the displays. "We did it, Fred," George said quietly. "We actually did it." "This is just day one," Fred replied, but he was grinning. "Wait until they see what we've got planned for year one." They sat in comfortable silence, two 17-year-old entrepreneurs who'd chosen laughter over fear, innovation over convention, and each other over everything else. "Know what the best part is?" George asked eventually. "The money?" Fred suggested. "The fame? The look on Umbridge's face?" "All good," George laughed. "But no, the best part is we're just getting started." Fred raised an imaginary glass. "To Weasleys Wizard Wheezes. May we never run out of ideas." "To us," George countered. "May we never grow up." "To Fred and George Weasley," they said together. "Bringers of chaos, makers of mischief, and now successful businessmen." As they prepared for bed in their new home, above their new shop, neither twin could shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something bigger than they'd imagined. The war was escalating. Dark times were coming. But they'd planted a beacon of light in the heart of Diagon Alley. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, production issues, ministry interference, the constant danger of the war. But tonight, they were 17, brilliant and masters of their own destiny. The legacy of the Weasley twins had officially begun. And somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, in a castle where their products were already becoming legend, Minerva McGonagall allowed herself a small smile as she read a note from two of her most troublesome students. "Professor, grand opening was a smashing success. Your letter of recommendation worked wonders. We've set aside a special discount for all Hogwarts staff, 50% off defensive products. Thank you for believing in us. Mischievously yours, Greed and Forge PS. The new shield hats are much less flamboyant. Only a tiny shower of sparks now. We're calling it Subtle Protection with Style.